turn our attention to the war in the Middle East. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, is alarmed by the security situation in Gaza. It comes as people fled the Jabalia refugee camp following reports of Israeli offensive in that area. Mr. Turk says that no place is safe in Gaza yet. Israel orders the evacuation of thousands of Palestinians from eastern Rafah.
I'm deeply distressed by the fast deteriorating conditions in Gaza as Israeli forces intensify airstrikes on Jabalia and Beit Lahia in northern Gaza and in parts of central Gaza. At the same time, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians are fleeing Rafah after the Israeli Defense Forces ordered further evacuations from the southern city, leading afresh to massive displacement of an already profoundly traumatized population. I'm also concerned by reports of indiscriminate rocket fire from Gaza. Since 6 May, when the IDF issued an evacuation order to Palestinians in eastern Rafah, more than 278,000 people have been displaced. This includes people with disabilities, the chronically ill, older people, the injured, pregnant women, and many others who are physically unable to move without help. The latest evacuation orders affect close to 1 million people in Rafah. So where should they go now? There is no safe place in Gaza. These exhausted, famished people, many of whom have been displaced many times already, have no good options. Other towns across Gaza, including Khan Yunis, which is supposed to receive those who are being displaced from Rafah right now, have already been reduced to rubble and remained under attack. These are not safe places. I've repeatedly expressed my alarm about the catastrophic impact of a possible full-scale offensive on Rafah, including the possibility of further atrocity crimes. I can see no way that the latest evacuation orders, much less a full assault in an area with an extremely dense presence of civilians, can be reconciled with the binding requirements of international humanitarian law and with the 2 sets of binding provisional measures ordered by the International Court of Justice. At this desperate moment, exacerbated by acts impeding the entry of humanitarian aid in Gaza through the 3 crossings, there is a dire shortage of fuel, which is hindering everything from the movement to distribution of food, operation of hospitals and emergency services, sewage treatment, and telecommunications. I'm also very worried about the safety of humanitarian workers in the affected areas. I reiterate, a full-scale offensive on Rafah cannot take place. All states with influence must do everything in their power to prevent it, to protect civilian lives. I call on Israel and Palestinian armed groups urgently to agree to a ceasefire.
Meanwhile, the United Nations says that one of its staff members was killed and another one injured as they traveled to a hospital in southern Gaza on Monday. It said the workers were traveling in a UN convoy to the European hospital near Rafah when it was struck. Although the UN Secretary General condemned this attack, the agency did not mention who was behind it.
He said the vehicle was struck by what?
Deeply to learn of the death of a United Nations Department of Safety and Security staff member, an injury to another DSS staffer when their UN vehicle was struck as they traveled to the European hospital in Rafah this morning. The Secretary General condemns all attacks on UN personnel and calls for a full investigation. He sends his condolences to the family of the fallen staff member. With the conflict in Gaza continuing to take a heavy toll, not only on civilians, but also on humanitarian workers, the Secretary General reiterates his urgent appeal for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire and for the release of all hostages. Turning to the situation on the ground in Gaza, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs says that ground incursions and heavy fighting continue to be reported in eastern Rafah, as well as Gaza City and the Jabalia refugee camp. The UN Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, reports that nearly 360,000 people have fled Rafah since the first evacuation order a week ago. Many of them have already been displaced multiple times over the past 7 months. We remain deeply concerned about the lack of protection for civilians and the lack of safety for humanitarian operations. Civilians must be protected and have their basic needs met, whether they move or stay. Those who leave must have enough time to do so, as well as a safe route and a safe place to go. Meanwhile, the World Health Organization reports that the incursion into Rafah has jeopardized the provision of health services, access to health care, and the delivery of life-saving supplies. WHO says that fuel shortages are also threatening the continuity of humanitarian efforts, saying that partners working on healthcare in Gaza require a minimum of 46,000 liters of fuel every day just for their operations. In case of an expanded military operation in Rafah, WHO warns that there would be a heightened demand for fuel. Further on Gaza, the Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Joyce Msuya, warned yesterday that the military offensive in Rafah spells further catastrophe for more than 1 million people who had been displaced to the city to escape fighting, disease, and hunger elsewhere. Ms. Msuya was speaking at an aid conference on Gaza hosted by Kuwait over the weekend.
In the meantime, UN means a refugee agency, UNRWA, is in Gaza. It is saying nearly 450,000 people have now fled Rafah since May the 6th. The agency is calling for an immediate ceasefire, stressing that people face constant exhaustion, hunger and fear. The Israeli military is continuing to operate with extreme force in Jalabiyah city and the surrounding areas. But so far, the health ministry in Gaza says that a total of 35,173 people have been killed and over 79,000 have been injured since the October 7th attack. Israeli protesters blocked 8 trucks destined for Gaza, throwing food packages onto the road and ripping bags of grain open in the occupied West Bank. The lorries, which were accosted West Hebron during Israel's observance of its 76th anniversary of independence, came from Jordan and were headed to the Gaza Strip, where people are in desperate need of humanitarian aid. The demonstrators, called the Zav 9 activist group, are protesting the continued detention of Israeli hostages in Gaza and seeking to hold humanitarian aid as long as they remain in captivity. Meanwhile, dozens of protesters rallied outside Israeli Prime Minister's office, Benjamin Netanyahu, at his residence in Jerusalem, protesting his handling of Israel's security and politics.
Now, in the last 7 months, we are protesting against his responsibility, his direct responsibility in what happened from October 7, 23 till today. And he is leading a really catastrophe, not only to Israel and not only to the Israeli people, but also to the peoples in Gaza and other parts.
I came from Tel Aviv. I used to demonstrate every day in Tel Aviv. But I decided this special evening to come to Jerusalem as close as possible to the home of Mr. Netanyahu, the person who is disaster to our future. He's damaging our future of the nation of Israel and all the citizens of Israel.
Hundreds of pro-Palestinian students set up tents outside the University of Athens during an overnight protest on Monday this week. Protesters waved Palestinian flags and chanted slogans in support of Gaza. Officials are saying that the vigil was organized by student unions and workers following similar protests in Europe and across the United States. The demonstrators are calling for the institutions to divest from Israel amid the ongoing conflict in Gaza.